Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Folks, welcome back to the show. This is your host, Pat Flynn. I am joined once again by the mighty and magnificent Pete Grailer. Pete, what's up?
Not a whole lot. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, man, always good to chat with you, and I'm sure we're going to have a fascinating conversation today. We're going to discuss what's sometimes called the problem of evil or the problem of pain, and this is an objection often used against the existence of God that I think should not be taken lightly, and that merits much consideration and conversation. It's something that I myself had to spend a lot of time wrestling with. I think it's something that all of us spend a good amount of time grappling with, because if there is one thing that is absolutely certain in this life is that none of us get out of here without some degree of suffering, and often quite a large degree of suffering. So the question arises, how does an all-loving, all-powerful God let this sort of stuff go on? That is the topic for today's discussion. And Pete, you're the man who brought this up, so I don't know if you have you wanted to tackle this one. I don't know if you have any initial thoughts on the matter. I think there's a couple different ways that we can and should proceed with this. It is a thorny topic, so I found kind of breaking it down into subsets is useful, but I'm curious what some of your initial musings happen to be.
Right. On the topic of good and evil, I actually took a class in college on hell and evil, it was called. It was a writing-based inquiry seminar. We read things like Dante and C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters and kind of waded into the idea of evil. And it was kind of a revealing class because the idea came up and we never got a real solid argument for or against whether good can exist without the existence of evil. And it's kind of something that, us as Christians and Catholics especially have to wrestle with is, if you start from the very beginning, if we have the argument of, the Marley was dead to begin with, so to speak, we have to start in the Garden of Eden. And this is the topic of one of my articles for a project me and Pat are working on together, is that idea of free will creeping in. And why, if God is a benevolent being, would he give us the option of a way out through free will and through the existence of evil? And I take the stance that God had to give us free will because we're not meant to walk through this life as marionettes simply for God's purposes. Let me clarify that a little bit. We're not marionettes. To choose God of our own free choosing is to love him far more than for him to be the only option. And I think through the sufferings of mankind, the fall of mankind, like I argue in this article, we come to more love for God through the existence of evil because, like we've said in previous conversations, faith is believing in something you have good reason and logic to understand and grasp. And I think that's kind of where we have to start wading through this whole existence of suffering as bringing us closer to God.
Yeah. So I like this, Pete. And the free will component, I think, will be a useful device for solving this riddle. And just to take a few steps back, when I said addressing the problem of evil in subsets or subcategories, the way I usually like to approach it, which is a pretty typical apologetic method, I think, is kind of separating the problem out, because there really are two distinct problems of pain. There is, on the one hand, the intellectual problem of pain, right? Is there some type of logical contradiction between an all-loving, all-powerful God and the existence of suffering and evil? That's the intellectual problem, right? That's dealing with it with your head. Then there's the emotional problem of evil. And this is the experiential problem, where we all go through tremendous periods of suffering. We witness other people going through tremendous periods of suffering. And how do we deal with that personally? Not so much in our head. Solving it in the head may help, but in the heart. And I think it's that second part that merits far greater conversation, because I think that's where most people are really stuck when they're stuck on this question. But let's spend some time on that first one and deal with it intellectually. And the reason I kind of like to pull these apart is when you're trying to solve a problem analytically or philosophically, it can almost seem like you're somewhat callous about it, right? And that's certainly not what we want to do when it comes to something as heavy as this. So by preemptively pulling these apart, I think we can say, okay, here's what we're going to do on one level, and then we're going to spend a lot more time on another level. So to draw this out, that the problem of pain or evil is typically an assertion brought about by an atheist trying to show that there is some logical contradiction between these two, the existence of these two things, which would be the existence of evil on one hand and the existence of an all-powerful, all-loving God on another hand. Mm-hmm. So why is this important to understand? What is the atheist trying to do here? Well, they're trying to show that God would be something like a square rectangle. And by showing that God would be something that is incoherent, they're trying to show that such a being could not exist. So it is important as an apologist to understand if you get into a debate with somebody who's presenting this argument, the burden of proof is on them. So a lot of times when these arguments go on, you see a lot of kind of speculation on the side of the theist or the Christian apologist of why God might allow all these various things to happen. And the burden of proof is shifted unnecessarily. That's not our goal. We might want to give those reasons on the emotional side, but on the intellectual side, all we have to do to solve this problem is show that there is no logical inconsistency between an all-loving, all-powerful God and the existence of suffering and evil. And that's actually fairly easy to do, because all we have to do is posit that there is some possibility, and this possibility may be well beyond our finite comprehension, but there is just some possibility that all the suffering and evil that exists could lead to some greater good eventually. And so long as that is even possible, doesn't matter if we can prove it or not, but so long as that is even possible, the apparent contradiction is gone. There is no incoherency anymore. So the intellectual problem is actually fairly easy to solve, because there's no way that as a finite, limited being, which both theists and atheists as human beings are, there's no way the atheist would ever be able to show that possibility isn't a possibility. So, I think it's really important to deal with that first, and to realize that the burden of proof is not on the theist to show, to give the reasons of why, for example, suffering and evil exists, of what those reasons are exactly. That is not our burden. The burden is on the atheist here to show that possibility is not, in fact, the possibility. And no atheist has ever been able to do that. So I like to get that part out of the way first. And Pete, I'm not sure if you wanted to throw anything into the mix there before we start talking about free will and the emotional side and all that.
No, I think that's a good point that you make, is the atheist argument of a good, benevolent God cannot exist if suffering exists. is kind of a moot point, because through our suffering, what drives people to look for things outside of themselves? That's literally when you're in a hole a mile deep and a foot wide, you don't have anything else to really reach out for. And that's really what, drives people out of the selfish look that I have a solution to my own human suffering. And I think that's what ultimately drives a lot of people to look into the divine.
Well, I think first off, even if we didn't have the empirical data to support this, it would be irrelevant. The argument would still stand. But I think we do have the empirical data to support this. We can see how religious sentiment, let's call it, grows in countries after they experience immense amounts of hardship or suffering, and also in our own personal lives, or the lives of people we know. Sometimes people have the greatest coming to Jesus, coming to God moment after a very, very traumatic event. Now, occasionally, of course, the opposite is true. Something terrible happens and somebody renounces God outright. They're angry at him, so they like to act as if he doesn't exist. But I think when you kind of unpack a lot of that, they're just angry that he would allow these things to exist. But again, none of that is even relevant to this part of the argument. It is not our burden of proof to give reasons why suffering and evil exists. All we have to insert is the additional premise that it's at least possible that suffering and evil could lead to some greater moral good eventually. And I think what those reasons are worth talking about when we're helping to console people on an emotional level. But if the atheist is making an assertion that there is some type of inherent contradiction here, the burden of proof is on them. So I think it's very important. I see a lot of people kind of getting duped on this argument of giving more reasons than they actually need to successfully show that no, there's no contradiction here. But take it a step further. Even though we don't need to, I do think it's interesting. Even if there was some type of contradiction. Yep. Can you still hear me? Still with me there, Pete? Testing 1, 2.
Yeah, I'm back.
I
don't know why, but I lost you for a minute.
It's all good. We can have the editor clip that out. So the thing I was saying is we can take it a step further and say that even if there was some type of contradiction, it's not necessarily a proof against the existence of God. It would just maybe be a proof against the Christian conception of God, right? It's still conceivable that a deist God exists who just created something and set the ball rolling and, yeah, sure, suffering and evil, and he just doesn't really care, right? He just wouldn't be all benevolent. So it's not even as an argument itself, it's even if it succeeded on some level, it wouldn't succeed ultimately is proving atheism is true. But the argument I think fails on the initial level, but it's worth pointing that out also.
Right. I think too, and to take this a step further and look at the life of Christ, if God didn't allow human suffering, and then, Jesus wouldn't be necessary at all. But to take that a step further as well, for Jesus to suffer so much in his final hours, being scourged at the pillar something like 40 times, having a crown of thorns thrust upon his head, having to carry his cross to Mount Calvary in order to die for our sins. Such a powerful experience that God would make himself go through that, and having the burdens of man. Jesus out in the desert being tempted by Satan is something that, we have to grapple with as well.
What I think Christ solves, Pete. Well, Christ solves, in my opinion, everything. But what I think he really solves here is that God is not indifferent to our suffering. He cares more deeply than we can ever imagine. He cares so much. He so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son to it. He is not indifferent to the suffering. He enters into it in its most extreme form. He is that ultimate loving parent that is sitting down, consoling that crying, suffering child. And what an incredibly powerful and moving reality this is when you grasp. This was what helped me solve it on the emotional level, by the way. It was Christianity. It was the person of Jesus and this and that. But I think we're getting a little bit ahead. I think it's worth still taking a few steps back, and because you already brought it up before, Pete, and we have this additional, I think, layer or defense against the problem of evil, which is free will. And like you said, it is better, more good is to be had from creatures that freely choose to love or freely choose to come in a loving, saving relationship with God and also a loving relationship with others rather than puppets or automata. God obviously knew this. So this is why, in one reason, that we were granted free will. Now, the ability to choose ultimately it includes the ability to choose poorly or wrongly. And when we say God is omnipotent, we only mean that God can do things that are logically possible. And it is not logically possible to force someone to freely choose something. So to the extent that we agree, I think we would all have to agree that to freely choose is good. To have that ability is a good, and especially to freely choose love is even better, rather than somebody who just created a bunch of marionettes, as you phrased it, Pete. And like, what kind of love is that? That's not actually love at all when you really start to break it down. But God cannot force people to freely do anything. That would be a square rectangle. That itself would be a logical contradiction. So we have another solution to the problem of evil with the free will defense as well. So I just wanted to go back and unpack that a little bit, since you kind of brought it up at the start.
Right. And going back to what I said, especially going back to the Genesis pre-fall argument, and stating that, one of the atheist things that I've run into, especially when, you dive into Genesis, Dennis Prager has faced this argument multiple times from the one and only Sam Harris. And he says, okay, God granted Adam and Eve free will, but to say that they weren't coerced by having God walk among them, being able to take in the full majesty and might and just all that is God, because it says in Genesis, God walked among them. And, after the fall, God was walking through the garden and Adam and Eve hid from him in shame, not able to yet take on that full majesty. As simple fallen human beings. And Harris made the point, God gave them free will, but they knew what they were getting, and to not choose God was almost not an option for them. Although there is that little tree in the corner of the garden away from everything else that they're not supposed to eat from. And that's really the only thing God demands of them at the time. Hey, you should choose me because here I am in all my shining glory and majesty. But to dismantle that argument, after the fall, we're cast out of the Garden of Eden. It said that the angel Gabriel, cast out Adam and Eve from the garden with a flaming sword. And, we were banished from paradise forever. And with that free will argument, it's like, look, we had paradise. We knew the great majesty and power and understanding of God through that. Why would we ever choose something different? And of course, the humanity, the upward grasping of the soul, like we talked about last time, Adam and Eve wanted to know the other side of the coin, in that they were tempted, like, I will give you all the knowledge of God, says Satan. And that is really what kind of started our suffering, the pride comes before the fall kind of argument.
Yeah, and Sam Harris is confused on a lot of things. I think he's also deeply confused on what free will actually is. Free will really means agent causation, that no past series of events ultimately determines what you choose. It's personal agency, autonomy of this. It doesn't mean that there's no influences. Of course there's influences, environmental, genetic, otherwise. But are those influences absolute? Like, is your decision that you're making an illusion that is somehow inextricably linked back to the beginning of time, right? You're just programmed deterministically. This is the materialist Sam Harris position because he's an atheist, right? Well, obviously not. And there's multiple grounds from which we can dismiss that. One is the absurdity of determinism to begin with. And that is, there's a number of absurdities with determinism. But if determinism were true, right, then rationality is completely out the window. Sam didn't choose to be a determinist. He didn't reason his way to determinism. He was determined to be a determinist. So he can't say that his determinism is any more reasonable than somebody's belief in free will. These are just offshoots of the evolutionary process. So he's constantly contradicting himself when it comes to his own philosophy. It's very peculiar. And if determinism was true, we would have no reason to think that any of our beliefs are true, because we don't have rationality. Again, if things are just selected for, say, survival value or the propagation of the species and DNA, that does not mean that these things are necessarily true. I mean, how could they? If somebody has a deterministic belief that was determined and somebody has a free will belief that is determined, one of these has got to be false, right? Mm-hmm. So determinism undermines its own philosophy on multiple accounts. It is self-referentially incoherent. You can't justify it. You can't justify determinism as a determinist, if that makes sense. But furthermore, we have great scientific grounds to show that it's false as well. I mean, we have the strong free will theorem that was proved in 2004, a very well-known study that showed if humans have free will, then the fundamental particles should also be able to display a certain amount of free will also, meaning they cannot be determined by past events. And that's exactly what was shown in the observational experiments. Now, without getting too much into the physics, what this proof really established was not how free will works. It established two things: that the ground for free will is there, and that determinism, so far as our most up-to-date scientific knowledge can tell us, is absolutely false. So why this deterministic philosophy continues to prevail is absolutely behind me. Science does not support it in any way. It is philosophically absurd, and just every properly basic belief tells us we have free will. We are autonomous agents. Agent causation is the reality. And unless we have some really good reason to deny that, we are perfectly justified in holding to it. So, man, yeah, it never seems to end with the new atheists and and their basis. I say new atheists. There's many great atheistic philosophers out there. Sam Harris is just not one of them. So getting back to the original part of the argument is, free will really helps to layer on another level of defense against the problem of evil. Now, Christianity in particular gives us a whole area, I think, of buffering as well, and just the nature of Christian doctrine explains why suffering and evil exists, and it explains it in a really complete and satisfying way also. But just from theism alone, assuming that we have free will and that there could possibly be some greater good achieved eventually, then there's no reason to allow the problem of evil and suffering to be an intellectual hang-up.
Right. I guess kind of where we could go from here is we could talk about why Christ is the answer to all of these questions that we're having. Can good exist without the existence of evil? And I think that, Christ especially, God coming to human form and understanding human suffering and living the life of a human being. God just could have stayed on high and told us, just kicked open the doors of heaven and let everyone in.
Mm-hmm.
But to suffer through human existence and end up choosing God at the end, many people have talked on this in many different religions. Mahatma Gandhi talked about, the uses for suffering to obtain, a higher moral understanding. Mother Teresa, especially, with her work in arguably the most poverty-ridden parts of India and Calcutta, she talked about the joys of simple living.
Mm-hmm.
And Saint Teresa of Avila talked about, her little sufferings in order to get closer to God. And my mother, God bless her soul, once again, Miss Uber Catholic.
Love it.
Every day she starts in the beginning, and at the beginning of her day, she says, I dedicate all my sufferings to, the Lord God, and, seeing that God has suffered through so much more than us, and it only takes us a sliver of the actual human suffering that God had to go through to deliver us all from our sins, is just what a great mystery.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the original point you said and all that, which is, can good exist by and of itself? And I think the answer is yes. That's exactly who God is. I mean, God, minimally defined ontologically, as a maximally great being, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. This is a being of moral perfection. He is the pinnacle of goodness. And this is important to understand, because you cannot picture, and that's perfectly logically coherent. There's nothing inconsistent about that. But you can't picture pure evil. There's how do you even try to conceptualize such a thing? Even the devil has good things about him. The fact that he is a being, it is better to be than not to be. So evil is just not metaphysically the same as good. They're not on the same metaphysical playing field, so to speak. Evil, it seems, is always parasitic on the good. It's a privation of the good in some way. And I think this is one of the great contributions that Aquinas helped to develop. But even before him, this is what helped pull this realization that good and evil are not metaphysically the same, helped pull St. Augustine away from Manichaeanism, which is, we've talked about this before, the easiest way to understand that philosophy is like the Force, right? There's a light side and a dark side, and they're battling it out. But when you understand, good and evil are not, they're not equivalent, metaphysically speaking, that evil is always some type of lack or privation in some way. It is parasitic on the good. I think that's a really important, really, really important thing to understand, because not only does that should help you to reject certain philosophies and religions that do see, kind of a light side and a dark side, these Star Wars type of religions, that just is not consistent. And there's a number of these Star Wars type of religions. It's arguable that Star Wars itself is a religion to some people.
Right. You can actually become a minister in the Jedi Order, if you can wrap your head around that.
Look, good movie, bad religion. And we know that it borrows from many religions. Lucas didn't just pull this stuff out of the air, right?
Right.
But once you understand the actual metaphysical relationship of good and evil, this again brings you to I would say at least a traditional monotheism, if not Christianity directly. So I think that's worth some pondering and some reflection. I think
Right.
it's something that really helps to further make sense of not only why suffering and evil exists, but what is suffering and evil exactly. And I think people too often do think that it is just like some Darth Vader. But look at Darth Vader. Even there were good things about him,
Right.
right? He ultimately turned around at the end.
Right. And you can, not to totally go down this rabbit hole that we're creating for ourselves, but if you simply watch the Star Wars movies and you treat the rebels as the enemies, it becomes a completely different movie.
Mm-hmm.
But to kind of get back to where we started.
But the funny thing about the Star Wars movie, Pete, is it really isn't like totally indifferent of good and evil, right? Like it does you know that some people are doing good things and are on the right side, and that other people are doing bad things or on the wrong side. So it's kind of inconsistent in that way with the type of philosophy it's really trying to promote, which is like, okay, it is not really good or bad. They're just kind of different, right?
Right.
And like, so they'll say one time, the dark side isn't really evil. It's just a necessary balancing agent. Right.
Right.
Well, no. When you watch the movie, you are rooting for the good people, right? You know that they're good. The bad guys are bad. So there's a bit of inconsistency going on there.
But and to kind of put this, the good and evil and art argument to rest, you take something like Star Wars and then go watch like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings series. Mm-hmm. Jackson did an incredibly great job of, with the cinematography, especially, showing, who's all good, who's all bad. He did a great job of making the orcs literally the ugliest creatures in planet Earth. And, the fire and brimstone of Isengard and Mordor, compared to the kind of the ethereal places like Rivendell with the elves, and the high kingdoms of the dwarves in the Hobbit movies that he created too. You see that differentiation between good and evil. And to kind of get back to where we started with this whole thing, laying that to rest, you said there, and I hate to put it this way, but this is kind of where we have to start the basis of unpackaging this, is there's some good in evil, right? It's that sugar-coated dung ball, so to speak. If you get past the baseness of what you're tempted by, it's evil is the thing itself, right? The teleological end to what looked good in the beginning. Dante unpackages this very well in Hell, in that in his the first book of the Divine Comedy, where Dante is walking through hell. It's everybody gets exactly what they wanted. The suicides, so to speak, the woods of the suicides, and you can only talk. The people, Dante wants to talk to somebody, and he's traveling with Virgil through hell, the great Roman philosopher, and they come to what's known as the woods of the suicides, and they're literally people in the shapes of trees, and to talk with them, you actually have to break their branches. And they get what they wanted, in that they gave away their self. They gave away their very soul, so they've become something else.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm debating whether we go right into the doctrine of hell at this point, because that is obviously another extension of this problem. How could an all-loving God send people to hell? But you already started to solve it for us, Pete. You said people ultimately get exactly what they want and choose. how could an all-loving God ultimately give us free will and then force us to be with him? That seems inconsistent. If you have the ability to choose God, you must also have the ability to not choose God. It's how you start to see that hell not only makes sense, but is ultimately necessary if you are to have an all-good, all-loving God. As jarring as that may seem initially, when you really start to unpack it, you see, no, if God is good, he had to give us the existence of hell. He had to give us that option to eternally separate ourselves from him. Otherwise, the whole point of having free will to begin with would be a joke. But let's go back a little bit, because I think we're now dealing with the emotional side. We're now ready to start trying to get people to see what some of these purposes to the evil and suffering in our lives might be. And I want to just go back and say again, for me personally, Christ answers all of this. His death on the cross, giving us that perfect reconciliation between an all just, all merciful, all loving God, that Father who cares so deeply for his children. It's just always that picture of a father, sitting down, consoling that weeping, sad, confused child, just magnified to infinity by Christ on the cross. But I think it's also important to refamiliarize ourselves with what the Christian faith actually entails. What are our doctrines? Because when we understand this and what Christ taught us, then we should not be surprised by evil. We should expect it for a couple of reasons. I'll list just a few. One, nowhere did God or Jesus ever say the purpose of this life was for us to be happy or not suffer. Never did they ever say that. Like that was never an initial promise. But for some reason, people tend to think like, why am I not happier? There's like, why is there so much suffering? When was that ever promised? Like, point this out. No, the promise, what God wants is not for us to be happy pets here on earth. That's not what he could have obviously made us pets here on earth, right? But he saw that some greater good could be had if he didn't just make us happy pets or marionettes or whatever. That if we could come eventually to a knowledge of God and develop certain character traits and virtues that would help us to even further love and come into that saving relationship with God, that would entail a far, far greater good than just, making us dopamine-laden, moronic cows grazing in a field. So I think it's important to always go back to that. And this doesn't mean that God doesn't want us to be happy here on earth. Of course, like all else equal, like, yeah, of course he wants us to be happy. This is what morality is for. Like God gave us a literal blueprint, not only to teach us how to love him and others, but he gave us a blueprint to flourish in this life here and now. Now, perfect happiness in this life is never going to happen. That's for the next life. We will have that, but we can still be imperfectly happy here and now.
I'm losing you again.
You tell me when you got me back, Pete. You got me back yet?
Yeah.
Sweet. So I'm just going to keep jamming. I was on a roll there. I was feeling it. So, we can be imperfectly happy in this life. And the way we do that is we follow God's commandments. We stay in line with the natural law. Not only is this the key to morality, but morality is the key to flourishing and developing that loving, saving relationship that will help us to achieve that perfect happiness in heaven. But happiness is not of this world. Perfect happiness, at least, is of next world. So just dispel yourself of that confusion if you've ever fallen into that. But then we also have the doctrine of sin, which tells us that we should, of course, expect evil, that mankind is essentially in rebellion against God. So, of course, there is evil. Of course there is suffering. Mankind has chosen this. That's what so much of Genesis and Christ taught us. And he obviously comes to redeem us and reconcile us to God by providing that ultimate sacrifice. But I think it's important to once you've solved the intellectual problem, to come back to the teachings of Christ and the church and realize that these doctrines not only do not promise against evil and suffering, but they almost, I would say they absolutely should get us to even expect it. This should not be a surprise to us if we understand what the Christian religion actually is about.
Right, and getting back to the whole Christ argument, Christ's whole life was essentially giving us the blueprint by which to enter heaven and come across God's knowing and loving salvation. A lot of people went to God or Christ and said, Master, teach us how to pray. Or, Master, I have an ailing child. What should I do? The miracles of Christ, showing us that he was the true presence of God with things like the raising of Lazarus or the wedding feast at Cana. And ultimately, giving us through the first Eucharist a way to come more closer into communion with him. And like you said, life is suffering. A lot of different religions have this, the cycle of samsara in Hinduism. The Buddhist monks creating the mandalas, and then as soon as they're done with them, destroying them because they realize, nothing is beautiful except the divine. And to kind of go along with that path, Jesus was the answer to, the strict, fire and brimstone God that was of the Old Testament. The burning of Sodom and Gomorrah, and sending Jonah out to try to convert, the name of the city escapes me right now, Nineveh. And him not being successful and God wrenching it to the ground. And like we said last time, and Isaiah and Ezekiel and Elijah, telling the Jewish people, it's okay, your suffering is not unseen by the Lord. And lo and behold, God sent the remedy that we all needed, albeit at the time it wasn't, seen as a remedy. We've been under Roman rule for 500 years, and the Lord said he would deliver us from all of our bondage and clean us from all of our suffering. And yet, after Jesus died, I think there was another, several hundred years of Roman rule throughout much of the known world at the time. The Jews were still fighting wars. They were a warring people for how long? And, if we look at the Bible, especially from Abraham through, the sufferings of the people under Moses and going through the desert for 40 years and God promising them, essentially what God promised them was their heaven, the land flowing with milk and honey. And, if we look at that, the Jewish people, especially through the Bible and, the first Christians, so much suffering went on even after Jesus left. You see the Acts of the Apostles, Peter and Paul literally had to be knocked off of his high horse from God, from, going to Damascus to slaughter a bunch of Christians. And, it's through Paul was stricken blind and taken in when he got to Damascus by a Christian and really taught the ways of God. And it's that kind of like striking us down off of our high horses and making us suffer through the pains and throes of life that I think is, something that is very powerful, like we said at the beginning, and leads us to a better understanding and love of God and love of Jesus through our own sufferings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think ultimately we're going to have to make this a two-parter, but I think in the next one we can share some of those experiences because, Pete, I know you and me both have multiple accounts of times of our lives that were extremely difficult, but that during the time we probably thought that there's no way anything good could ever come out of this, and then ultimately some greater good really did, which keeps that that possibility always open. So I think what we do now, since we're at about our hour here, is let's just do like a brief summary, right? So what we said is people sometimes object to the existence of God with the problem of pain, which says, how can there be an all-loving, all-good, all-powerful God and the existence of suffering and evil? Isn't there some type of logical contradiction here? And again, to show that there isn't, you only need to posit the additional premise that so long as there is the possibility of some greater good that eventually could be achieved by this, it solves the problem intellectually, and it solves it on every level. It doesn't matter whether it's great evil or the most, what might seem like the most unnecessary suffering in the world, whether it's natural disasters or what have you, because we just don't know. We don't know how things connect to each other, what their effects are over time. We are finite. We are not omniscient like God is. So we're in no position to speculate and say that some greater good could not come out of any amount of suffering or evil that we see in the world. So that's how you deal with it on the intellectual level. But that's not where most people, let's be honest, that's not where, aside from like in the academic papers, that's not where most people are stuck with this argument. Most people are stuck on the emotional level. They experience suffering, they experience evil. And I think what we've tried to hint at, Pete, is that this is solved by Christ on the cross. There is no other way that you can solve this that gives life, that answers life's most important questions, meaning, identity, origin, morality, and destiny. Christ answers everything for us. He also answers our suffering by entering into our suffering, by taking it onto himself. And like you said with your mom, Pete, by saying, give your suffering to me. Yes, give it all to me. Trust in me. Thy will be done. Never forget that. That to me is the most powerful, at least that's the part of the Our Father that I always need to keep reminding myself, your will be done, not mine, because you know, God, way, way better than I do. I have no idea. I'm just a small, finite being. But Christianity gives us the answers that we need to make sense of the suffering and evil here on earth to solve that emotional problem. Any final words, Pete?
Right. I think, like you said, this is a lot to unpack, and an hour is just not enough. But I think we scraped the surface, and that's exactly where I wanted to end too, is the thy will be done. When we submit to God on high and realize that we don't know it all, and that our suffering may be for some higher purpose towards his will, is when we really start to live the fulfilled life that we're meant to live here on earth, and then to come into his kingdom at the end.
And to that, I would say, amen. We'll see you next time, folks.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.